Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 5th of June. I'm Andrew Wilson and this is the Full Scottish. This afternoon I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 102 of the illegal Russian war of aggression, and then I will introduce today's guests, and then together we will take a look at the week's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Ukrainian forces have been managing to push back against Russian troops in fierce fighting in Severodonetsk, despite Moscow throwing all its power into capturing the eastern city, Ukrainian officials said on Saturday. The Russian president, Vladimir Putin, has said that Moscow's anti-aircraft forces have shot down dozens of Ukrainian weapons and are cracking them like nuts in an interview that aired yesterday. Kyiv has rebuked the French president, Emmanuel Macron, for saying it was important not to humiliate Russia. The Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, tweeted in response, "Calls to avoid humiliation for Russia can only humiliate France and every other country that would call for it, because it is Russia that humiliates itself. We all better focus on how to put Russia in its place. This will bring peace and save lives." Western sanctions would not have an effect on Russia's oil exports, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said. Lavrov also predicted a significant increase in profits from energy shipments this year, Russian news agency TASS has reported. An EU decision to extend sanctions against the Russian billionaire Andrew Melnichenko and his wife is irrational because she has never held Russian citizenship or resided in Russia, a representative of the couple has said. The EU sanctioned Melnichenko's wife on Friday as part of a sixth round of sanctions against Russia for waging a war against Ukraine. The Ukrainian Defense Minister, Alexei Reznikov, said that while it was impossible to predict when the war would end, my optimistic prognosis is that it is realistic to achieve this as early as this year. Negotiations with Russia will only resume after new weapons arrive from the West and Ukraine's position is strengthened, said David Arakhamia, a member of Ukraine's negotiation group with Russia. Another negotiator, Mikhailo Podyalak, said there was no point in talks with Russia until Moscow's forces are pushed back as far as possible towards Ukraine's border. Ukraine's intelligence services are in communication with hundreds of captured Azovstal steelworks fighters, and Kyiv is doing all it can to ensure their release, according to Ukraine's Interior Minister, Denis Monastyrski. Ukraine wants the fighters to be returned in a prisoner swap. However, some Russian officials have said that forces could be tried or executed. The US has expressed support for international investigations into war crimes committed in Ukraine, the US Embassy in Kyiv has announced. Those responsible for war crimes, including direct perpetrators and those who ordered them, must face justice, the embassy tweeted yesterday. A famous monastery in eastern Ukraine, Svatohirsk Lavra, caught fire after it was hit by Russian shelling. The monastery is affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate, which is run by Putin's supporter, Patriarch Kirill. There were reports that 4 monks were killed as a result of the attack. And the Ukrainian First Lady, Olena Zelenska, and other officials commemorated 261 children killed by the Russian war against Ukraine by hanging bells near the St. Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv. The bells symbolize the voices of the killed children, the Euromaidan press has reported. Now, this afternoon, we're lucky enough to be joined by 2 fantastic guests on the Full Scottish. Firstly, we have joining us is Emma Harper. Emma is the SNP member of the Scottish Parliament for the South of Scotland. She's a degree-registered nurse and a member of the Royal College of Nursing and the Association for Perioperative Practice. In 2016, she was elected MSP to the Scottish Parliament for South Scotland, and Emma was returned once more at the last Scottish election. Emma, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Good afternoon, Andrew. I'm absolutely fine, thanks.
Well, thank you for joining us today on the Full Scottish, Emma. And we're also joined by Hugh Marshall. Hugh is the publisher of Corgi Cymru, a Welsh language digital news service, and also the National Wales newspaper, which is a sister to our own national paper in Scotland. He's the founder of Anwen Wales, the bilingual inclusive digital companion, and also Talking Wales, which is a new audio platform for Wales. Hugh, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Pnawnda, I'm very well, thank you.
Well, thank you to you as well for joining us on the Full Scottish today. It's a pleasure to see you. When I was giving you the Ukraine update a moment ago, we were talking about, or I was talking about Kyiv having rebuked President Macron for saying it was important not to humiliate Russia. And the Ukrainian foreign minister had tweeted in response, criticizing and, as I say, rebuking Mr. Macron. Emma, for you, first of all, when the war started, there were discussions in the context of what the Chinese writer Sun Tzu calls building a golden bridge, which in order to allow your defeated opponent to walk away and bring an end to conflict. Do you think that now is the time, perhaps, for us to be thinking about building a golden bridge, Emma, in order that Vladimir Putin can walk off the battlefield?
It's hard to know what's in President Putin's head sometimes. So I think whatever negotiations take place, there needs to be very careful constructs about how an exit can be made, because I would favour that they need to do whatever they can to cease and stop this. I mean, we're 102 days in. There's so many civilians have been killed. There's been cities and towns devastated by it's what seems like indiscriminate bombing. So, the whole world is watching, and I think we need to support whatever methods can be taken for an exit for Vladimir Putin, because yeah, he started all of this.
That's a very fair point, Emma. And Hugh, I suppose in a sense the same question to you as a starter. Do you think that we should be pushing for the construction of a framework that would allow a ceasefire and then some form of peace, or should we, in contrast, should we be allowing the Ukrainians to determine how this war is progressed? It's their country that's being fought over, after all.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's up to the Ukrainians, and I think we have to remember, we have this vision that 102 days of war. The reality is the war's been going on between the Ukraine and Russia for over 8 years now, and I think a lot of us were guilty. I'm the same. I wasn't aware of the annexation of Crimea and how Russia came about sort of taking that piece of land from the Ukraine. And I think that's the big thing now is, we're far more aware of what is going on. But the problem, obviously, at the end of the day is Putin. You're not dealing with somebody, rational. You can sit down and discuss with, we all remember Macron was talking within 2 days before they invaded Ukraine, Macron saying, that they weren't going to invade. And I think Putin basically, I was reading some stuff online yesterday. It's very interesting. He controls the narrative in Russia. He controls the media. So basically, he can just tell people in Russia what's going on, and unfortunately, they believe him because he has that control. I think we need to put pressure on, and I think we need to be harder on Russia as well, because I think you were talking earlier, 261 children. That's who we know about, who've died so far. It's heartbreaking what's going on, and the fact that in the Donbass region now they're finding more mass graves. This isn't just a war over land. It is something where they're literally trying to eradicate people.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting point that you make, Hugh. The 261 children that I mentioned there, and who are being commemorated by the wife of President Zelensky by hanging bells at the St. Sophia Cathedral. 260 children strikes me as a reasonably large primary school. Is it a reflection, perhaps, of how we have become used to conflict or used to war, that the eradication of the role of a primary school, the death of an entire role of a primary school, that is not something that's headline news and has pushed everything and is the headline news constantly? What does it say that's not the case now?
Well,
Is that
from me, I just think it's.
No, no, no. Sorry. My apologies, Emma. I should have been clearer. Emma, I was going to ask you.
okay? Sorry, Andrew. Thanks. Yeah, 261 children is it's a huge number, and the media, it would, I suppose, would be more clearer if people across Scotland and the rest of the UK can absolutely see that, and what Zelensky's wife is doing by hanging bells. It is pretty devastating. It's heartbreaking, actually, and huge. This hasn't been going on for 102 days. That has been going on since 2014, the annexation of Crimea. And so now, though, we are more aware of what is going on. People are aware of the names of the cities across Poland that are being devastated indiscriminately. So I think we do need to focus on paying more attention to these crimes that are happening against the children, against the parents, against everybody that's remaining behind in Ukraine. It is pretty heartbreaking to see what's happening.
Absolutely, Emma. Now, Hugh, I will come back to you. My apologies for that mix up there. There's a story reporting this morning that strikes me that you may, from your own experience, have a perspective on. What I'm thinking about is the change, the cultural change in parts of Ukraine that have come about as a result of the war. There's reporting this morning in The Guardian, I think, about a chap, a young man, Gamlet Zinkivsky, who's in the city of Kharkiv. He grew up speaking Russian, but the invasion was what he describes as the final push for him to switch fully to Ukrainian. He said, unfortunately, I grew up speaking Russian, but it's not pleasant to speak the same language as the army that is destroying whole areas of our country. And he was saying that the switch of language is part of a broader journey towards a more pronounced Ukrainian identity for him and others, especially in many of the largely Russian-speaking areas in the east and the south of Ukraine. And he also said that that process of the spread of speaking Ukrainian as the first language had become more pronounced over the past 3 months, but has been on the agenda for the past few years now. I was going to ask you about the cultural significance and the wider significance of language and the spoken language, in particular, thinking of how much you do for the Welsh language.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting. And again, we've learned so much over the last few months about about the cultural situation, because obviously, there are parts of the Ukraine where Russia is the predominant language. And, I don't know, I'm sure many of those people who are Russian, first language Russian speakers in the Ukraine do feel Ukrainian. And the other way around, that there are people there who live in Ukraine, who are Russian speakers, who do have that closer links to Russia. But you would hope that anybody based, regardless of language and cultural identity, that you wouldn't want to identify or align yourselves with an aggressor, in the way that Russia have acted, because I think in Wales is quite interesting. The Welsh language is compared with the Gaelic in Scotland and Irish in Ireland. It's still a very strong language. There's almost 1 million Welsh speakers. I've just spent a week now in Denbigh in the Urdd Youth Festival. 120,000 families, kids, parents, spending a week taking part in cultural competitions, but also just being able to sort of be out and about speaking Welsh on just on a normal basis. So the Welsh language is strong here. The Welsh language is stronger in the western parts of Wales, and that's where Plaid Cymru, their heartlands, and they're stronger there. But there is this sense, the discussion in Wales going on at the moment, and we've covered it in the National, and I think the National of Scotland have covered it, around things like the Jubilee, about people's associations with Britishness, Welshness, Scottishness. A lot of people now identify as Welsh, not British, or vice versa. And I think especially with the younger generation, I think they are moving away from that. But one of the big things that's driven sort of Welsh identity over the last few years is our football team. The success of Wales getting to the Euros, and the fact that the Welsh football team have embraced the language in their comms. The Welsh language is a big part. Hein Ladman had that, is sung during the game, our national anthem, and also David Iwan O'Hyd, he was singing before the last game, he'll be singing today. So it's interesting to see football fans who previously wouldn't have been, majority probably English speaking, actually singing Welsh language songs. So, there is a shift going on here culturally.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I knew you'd have a perspective on this, and I knew you'd be able to help us with that. I've got one final question in connection with Ukraine before we move on. And Emma, it's a question that I asked that we spoke about on the programme on Monday this week, and it's been in my mind all week. The destruction of Mariupol and now the apparent intention to destroy Severodonetsk. If we see, once we get reporting from these cities, if we see the level of destruction, which I suspect is going to be on the same kind of scale as we saw in some Syrian cities, because the military tactics that the Russians are using are the same. It's Soviet era tactics called the cauldron, I think. I'm switching from culture back to politics now, Emma, for you. So, do you think our European politicians and European voters are they going to be prepared to accept another Aleppo, another city destroyed, but this time on European soil?
I mean, we're continually seeing like the destruction of Mariupol and everything around. It is pretty tragic, and I don't think people will accept that. I think we need to move forward and end this in whatever way can be done to take forward. I mean, I just I didn't see the show on Monday, so I don't know the discussion around it. But we need to figure out what can be done. I know that in Scotland we've got a fantastic minister, Neil Gray, who's our minister for Ukraine, and he's doing everything he can within our devolved settlement, because we don't have powers over immigration, but to help support a framework to help refugees resettle. But I'm sure that when people are in Scotland that are being supported in homes, they're seeing the devastation of their cities and probably want to make sure that that whatever we can do, we can support the end to this war, and then the rebuilding that needs to happen after that.
Thank you, Emma. We'll move on from Ukraine now and come back to the British Isles for our next item. We've been watching and listening and reading about the build-up to the Jubilee commemorations or celebrations that have been wall-to-wall over the past few days. Hugh, you mentioned you've been at the Youth Festival this week, but I was going to ask you, what's your reflection on what's been happening in connection with the Jubilee in your part of the world?
Yeah, it's been fascinating, and I've been really lucky to a certain extent. But when the air of visitors visits an area, as I say, it moves around every year. It's tradition that the outlying town and villages are festooned in red, white, and green bunting and Welsh flags. We've got the mascot of the Earth is called Mr. Earth, who's basically a red, white, and green triangle on legs who wanders around having his photo taken with the kids. So I'd imagine English visitors would have come to this part of Wales and be in for a hell of a shock, because basically expecting to see red, white, and blue bunting and Union Jacks, and it's literally just a sea of red, white, and green. But in all honesty, places like Carnarvon has got significance. It was the location of the investiture in 1969 of Prince Charles being made the Prince of Wales, and it has always been, even though it's a Welsh-speaking. One of the most, well, probably the most Welsh-speaking town in Wales. It had that royalist connection, and I know they've had royal visits. But a friend of mine was doing a walking tour yesterday around Carnarvon, a historic one, and they didn't spot a single piece of red, white, and blue bunting. And I think that's quite symbolic now. I think there is an era now, of not being anti-monarchy, but just realizing that time is moving on. and we're living in a different era. So I think, yeah, it's been great this week, because I've been, on the air of mice every day, meeting people and discussing people, and it's been a complete jubilee-free zone.
That must be the only part of it, well, from my perspective, probably the only part of the UK, to be honest. Hugh, Emma, turning to the politics a little bit. Lucy Powell, the Labour MP, has been writing in the press this morning. She said, "Patriotism is also a belief, confidence, and determination that our country's future can be better than our past, and a promise to British people that the next generation will do better than the last." She then says, "Labour will defend and protect our values, traditions, and institutions, but also ensure that we, like the Queen and the monarchy, move with the times and keep Britain at the cutting edge of innovation." It struck me as a remarkable piece of writing, and probably a little bit insightful in terms of where what I would refer to as British Labour is at the moment. Do you think, Emma? Do you think that is this an indication that the British Labour Party is deluded, or that the hypocrisy is taking over? Not least the implication that British Labour's patriotism is great, but from a Scottish perspective, everybody else's patriotism must be suppressed.
Well, quite often people say, though, let's celebrate our independence. Let's celebrate how the empire of the past. I do think we need to move forward and look forward to being outward looking and international in our policies and progress. And to hear Labour just like defending this, it is a bit hypocritical, because they're talking about the let's celebrate our Britishness, but yet we can't celebrate the fact that people in Scotland want to be independent. So it is interesting how one minute they can say one thing, and the red, white, and blue flag waving is great for the celebrating of what the Queen has contributed for 70 years. But we do need to remember that we've got a cost of living crisis, we've got some real challenges, we're trying to tackle poverty. And in Scotland, I think we need to be able to do that, making our own decisions with our own pot of money that we have, without being controlled by Westminster and the fiscal constraints that are put upon us. So I would like to see Labour maybe come a bit clean, maybe be a bit more true. There's lots of Labour folk in Scotland that are keen to progress forward, instead of always looking back and looking back and harking to a distant past. I think we do need to make progress and help support the people to make their own decisions.
That's a good point, Emma. And sticking with you for a moment, I was wondering as Keir Starmer and Lucy Powell this morning, as they wrap themselves ever more tightly in the Union flag, does that tell us that in terms of the Labour Party and Labour Party politics, that the only thing that they are concerned about is the red wall in England? They're wrapping themselves up in the Union flag in order to speak to working class voters in the red wall, the so-called red wall constituencies that they lost at the last general election. So does this tell us that the British Labour Party is only really bothered about those red wall seats, and politics, both in Scotland and by implication in Wales as well, are really not a priority for them?
Definitely, I think that's evident. We heard last week, at First Minister's questions, First Minister even making a comment about the next Labour leader being Michael Mara. And, so the Labour are really struggling in Scotland, and we know that we've had fantastic election results at the most recent local authority elections in Scotland. Devastation for the Tories, but also for Labour. They didn't come out all rosy, and I think we need to, again, Labour maybe need to take a good hard look at themselves and see what kind of Labour Party they would be if they weren't shackled to Westminster and Westminster parties. We need probably a more independent Labour in Scotland.
Thanks, Emma. That's really helpful. Hugh, coming back to you, both Lucy Powell and you have both spoken a little bit about whether it appears that the UK as it exists at the moment is looking backwards or looking forwards in terms of its ambitions and in terms of its priorities. I think it's fair to say that we have a Tory government at the moment which is very policy light. We get lots of stories and lots of policy announcements in terms of things that will play well on the front pages of the Daily Express and the Daily Mail, but we don't see an awful lot of actual action. And possibly the only action we've seen that since Christmas time really has been focused around the Jubilee and planning for that. We know that Johnson in particular likes a celebration and likes to dress up in red, white and blue. The image of him suspended from the walkway at the Olympics seldom leaves my mind. But in terms of what you've seen and you've been reading and your experience in Wales this past week, do you think, is it fair to say that is the UK looking? Do you feel that the UK is forward looking at the moment, or is it focused entirely upon the past?
I think it's really interesting. I think just picking up on the points you just made now about Labour in England, in Scotland, and obviously it's different in Wales because they're in power in Wales in the Senedd, and they have been since devolution was introduced. And at the local elections, they did very well in their heartlands and the valleys and in the cities in the south. But across Wales and other areas, they didn't perform too well, and they have had they've had a big boost during COVID because Mark Drakeford has done a very good job of speaking up for Wales and leading Wales and putting Wales ahead of other interests. But Labour in Wales and Labour in England, how this is going to play this this Union Jack, as you say, this unionism. Opinion poll that was conducted, I think, last year showed over half of Labour voters support independence. So the Labour Party in Wales are on a journey, and I think they're starting to see now that they need to detach themselves. What Labour in Wales need to decide is, are they the party that represents Wales and puts Wales' interests first, or are they a part of a small part of a bigger organisation that has ambitions to rule in Britain? Because I think a lot of people forget 83% of the electorate live in England, so any political party that's based in London is going to speak to that majority because they know that those are the seats they're going to win. I can't speak for Scotland, but I know in Wales we've never had a Conservative majority. So in the last since the Second World War, I think we've had about 2/3 of the time we've had Conservative governments sort of forced upon us. And I think Labour in Wales are on an interesting journey. There's a group now, Labour for Indy, who are actively discussing Labour supporting independence, and it's really interesting to see that they're looking more to embrace it rather than the Labour in Scotland who are still clinging on to almost like a unionist sort of thing. But I think it's different to Scotland because I think religion and the element of the religious side doesn't exist in Wales. Whereas in Wales, it goes back to the unions, the coal industry and the steel industry, and that's where the Labour Party grew from in Wales. But I think definitely, I think in Wales, wrapping yourself in the Union Jack isn't going to do you any favours, if you're in the Labour Party. So again, there's tensions there, and I think a lot of people are asking in Wales, it's high time that Wales just Labour in Wales separated themselves. And obviously, Mark Drakeford is going. He announced before the later Senate elections, I think he was going to serve about 3 years. So we're now in the process of who is going to follow him. And I think he's in a unique position where his legacy is potentially, sort of taking Wales further down the route to greater devolution and independence. We've just had, we're going to be expanding the Senedd now to having over 90 members. So, there is expansion there. There's a desire to have greater devolution because, maybe your, Scottish viewers aren't aware that we have far less devolution in Wales compared to Scotland. We have health and education and transport devolved, but that's it basically. We don't have much fiscal power. But yeah, no, it's interesting times. But I think, Labour in England are basically, when they talk about being British, they're just talking about being English.
That's absolutely right, Hugh, and we will come back to talk about the financial implications of devolution in an item later on this afternoon in our conversation. But Emma, picking up on some of the things that Hugh was saying there, in terms of Labour members of the Scottish Parliament who you work with and who you see every week in your working life, are you detecting any indication that the Labour Party in Scotland is open to change or will change, as you say, to reflect the majority of Labour Party members who also support independence, or instead is the control of the British Labour Party in Scotland, is it hardening up? Is it becoming more fundamentalist in terms of it being a unionist party first and a socialist party second? Are you seeing any change amongst Labour politicians, Emma?
It's difficult to detect, like whether there's an outward real physical change, but it is interesting to note where certain members sit in chamber and then who they speak to and then what they say in debates. And I know there's this constant calls from my colleagues that are Labour colleagues in the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee wanting the government to use all the levers it can, do everything you can to mitigate the cost of living crisis, or help support people into employment, or look at tackling poverty, for instance. But yet, when they're challenged about devolution of employment law, they just put their hands up in the air and then stare blankly ahead of them. So, they can't talk out of both sides of their face and ask the Scottish Government to do one thing under the fiscal constraints that we have, right? Because we don't have power over employment law, and then the ability to support people out of poverty. The universal credit uplift was withdrawn. That was 20 quid a week, and now the Scottish Government are mitigating that. So sometimes I think we see that there is a unity in chamber depending on what debate is being taken forward. But I definitely think that there are members in Labour in Scotland that are questioning, even if it's behind the scenes, what way they need to act in order to regain votes, because they are like party number three in the Scottish Parliament, and I'm sure they aren't happy about losing to have the Tories at number two, but they certainly need to do something different if they want to regain like votes in Scotland, and right now that's no happening.
Thanks, Emma. I knew you'd have some helpful insights from inside the chamber and from watching your fellow MSPs and the way in which they operate. But let's move on to our next item this afternoon, because it's been reported today that the UK's aviation minister was warned at the start of the year that the widespread flight chaos that we've witnessed over the past couple of weeks was inevitable. And he was told that government intervention was urgently required to prevent the disruption. And this is according to sources within the trade union movement. They say that during a phone call in January, Robert Courts was told that the industry would not be able to cope with high demand unless it received help to offset chronic staff shortages. And the predictions from January have played out with what are described as farcical scenes last week, with hundreds of flights cancelled during one of the busiest travelling weeks of the year, alongside day-long delays and massive queues snaking out of terminal buildings. Probably inevitably, Michael O'Leary of Ryanair has stepped in and is quoted this morning as saying, pre-Brexit, you would have had lots of Eastern Europeans doing baggage handling, the check-in jobs and the airport security jobs. They all went home during COVID. There is a real tightness in the labour market, he continued, which is an absolutely direct result of Brexit. And it's not just O'Leary who's having his say. The Jet2 chief, Stephen Heapy, says that Brexit has excluded thousands, if not millions, of people out of the travel industry. So, Hugh, coming to you first, in terms of the economic impact that we're seeing now, for example, in the travel industry, is Michael O'Leary correct when he says that people left during COVID, but it's definitely a result of Brexit? Is it both of these things, or are you sensing that it's more Brexit or more COVID?
I think it comes down to just sort of capitalism and the way, especially the sort of travel industry. It is one of those industries when COVID came in. Obviously, it was the it was the biggest sort of area industry that was impacted, because obviously because people weren't able to travel, it was hard hitting. I had a friend who was cabin crew with Virgin, furlough, laid off, made redundant. And obviously, when things were starting to pick up again, making the approach, and a lot of those people felt they were so badly treated by those companies who didn't think that that they were going to see a longer term. I think they tried to profiteer from it by just getting rid of people and hoping that they'd be able to pick up people cheaper on the other side of COVID. And obviously that hasn't worked. And we've had problems in Cardiff Airport, because we've only got one airport here, and it's not this big airport, but there has been huge problems there. But we've also here got the double whammy. We've got the passport office is based in Newport, and that's been a nightmare again, because they were promised they needed 900 new recruits, and I think they've had 300. So even when UK government are making promises about employing more people and stuff, that they're just not delivering on it. But I think when it comes down to it, it's just companies, travel companies, especially airlines, they are quite sort of savage when it comes down to sort of making money, and I think they took decisions that alienated people in the industry, and a lot of them decided, I'm not going back to it.
Thanks, Hugh. That's really helpful. Emma, for you, I'm going to pivot for a moment. Still thinking about holidays, but not holidays abroad, but holidays at home. And I'm going to look at this from a Welsh perspective. I'm interested in your thoughts, firstly, Emma, and then Hugh, I'll come to you as well for some more Welsh context. But excuse me, we've been told this week that the owners of second homes in Wales could face a huge tax hike next year. There are proposals which are part of a move to tackle the negative impact of vacant houses and holiday lets, and the impact that soaring property prices have on local communities. And the proposal is that local authorities can set council tax premiums on second homes and long-term empty properties, and increase the council tax on them by up to 300%. At the moment in Wales, the maximum possible increase is 10%. Now, the Finance Minister in Wales, Rebecca Evans, has said that these changes will give more flexibility to local authorities to provide more support to local communities, addressing the negative impacts that second homes and long-term empty properties have. And she said that they are some of the levers we have available to us as we seek to create a fairer system. Now, these measures are part of a wider commitment to address second homes and a lack of affordable housing facing communities in Wales, which were set out in the cooperation agreement between, as Hugh was saying, the Labour-controlled Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru when they sought to cooperate in 2021. So, two questions really, Emma. Firstly, do you think that this approach is something that we should be considering and implementing in Scotland as well? And secondly, what's your reflection on this apparent successful cooperation between the government in Wales and Plaid Cymru, in contrast or in similarity to the cooperation in Scotland between the SNP government and the Greens?
Okay, thanks. It is, I suppose, we're hearing about the challenges of second homes and second home ownership in Scotland, and the issue of holiday lets and things like that. So I do welcome what the Scottish Government are taking forward as far as licensing for for local authorities to then choose how they would implement a licensing scheme. We've heard about the challenges of holiday cottages versus homes on the island of Skye, as well as in Edinburgh. Those are two prime examples that are used all the time for second homes and holiday homes. So the issue around having houses for people to live in all year round is a huge issue. It's a huge issue for us in Dumfries and Galloway, for instance, and we have to find a balance of having a house for a family that could be then recruited to live in the area, and that way then they can continue to contribute to the schools, to the economy, to have families living in here. So the issues around additional council tax and all of that is something that will be I suppose, discussed and taken forward. I'm aware of conversations where appeals are being made to specifically look at second homes that people have, and how can that be addressed, for instance. And the big challenges that that some of our people have in my area are that the farmers have the cottages on their land, and that's helping supplement the income for their farming activity. So we have to be really careful about unintended consequences for rural businesses and for supporting people to come and live and choose to live and work. We do want tourists, but we want people to come and live and work in our area as well. And the Scottish government have built, I think, 88,000 old affordable homes in the last few years. So that's something that has been very, very proactive when Kevin Stewart, when he was the Minister for Housing, took that forward. So there's loads of, I suppose, spokes to this wheel of doing what we need to do in order to support people moving to the area, but also to support rural businesses as well.
Thanks, Emma. And Hugh, coming back to you to think about the politics of this a little bit more, it strikes me that second homes in Wales has been a strong political issue for decades. I'm old enough to remember the torching of second homes in Wales being a political statement and being at least one part of the campaigning for devolution and potentially for independence for Wales. Now we're seeing second homes back on the political agenda in a slightly different way. But do you think, in terms of the politics of this announcement, is it as much a call to the past and a reflection of previous politics in Wales as being about the current problems that we're facing?
I think it is one of the biggest issues facing people in sort of, especially in rural communities along the west of Wales. Young people just cannot afford to live in to buy into the communities where they were brought up. And I think it's one of some people are critical of Plaid Cymru for going to doing a cooperation deal with Labour, but I think this is an example of how it has worked very effectively. The Plaid and Labour have worked together to come up with sort of policies and actually action that is happening sort of quite rapidly to sort of try and help this situation. And there's a cultural bit as well in Wales, I think, that isn't seen in other parts of the UK. Is a lot of these areas where the Welsh language is at its strongest, and what you're finding is they're becoming sort of retirement places, or people are just visit them occasionally. It's having an impact on small village schools having to close because of the numbers, because young people can't afford to live, they're moving away, they're not able to have those families. And I think one of the things we need to look at as a post-COVID dividend is the fact that people can now work from wherever, can work from home. There's an opportunity here to try and encourage people to move back to their communities and stay in their communities and work. But then, there's a double-edged sword there, obviously, because obviously it's making it attractive. And I know a lot of people during COVID, sold up in London, whatever, moved down to Wales, and we're going to have a new lifestyle. And a lot of those people, funnily enough, after 6 months of living in the middle of nowhere, gave up and went back. But yeah, no, I think it's a positive move, and it's something that needs to be dealt with, because it's literally killing communities.
Can
Thanks,
I
Hugh.
just pick up on that, Andrew?
Please, Emma. Yes.
So Hugh makes a great point about people moving from London to other areas in West Coast, for instance, or moving to Wales. And now that we're seeing people working from home, um, that is a model that is being explored, obviously, where folk can maybe do 2 or 3 or 4 days from home and then 1 day in the office, or a couple of days a month. And obviously, we need to make sure that we've got the support of better connectivity. So whether it's road and rail links, which is a real challenge in the southwest, but also broadband. And we've seen in Scotland, the Scottish government have invested like £300 million in superfast broadband with the DSSB, and then now the Reaching 100 programme. And actually, the UK government have submitted I think it's like 28 million on that. So, so I think we should be highlighting and celebrating the fact that the Scottish Government is looking at whatever model we can do to support people to move rurally, live rurally, work rurally, contribute to local economies, and then support them with the best, digital connectivity as well. And we've seen how that has worked during COVID. The COVID was like a light switch for people to be able to stay at home, work from home, and see their doctors and their appointments and their GP, I suppose, appointments that way as well. So COVID has meant that we've highlighted so many things that we need to say, okay, what's the good stuff? And let's keep it. And then let's, keep that and then support that and take on that as we move forward.
And can I just say that's another good thing that the Welsh Labour government have done. They've actually looked at it and said, right, we're going to actually have a percentage of people not working from home necessarily, but working from their communities. And I think that's the big difference, because what you found is, okay, Cardiff has lost out from, people buying, in shops and stuff, but it's really benefited those communities in the valleys, for example, where people used to commute in from. They're staying in their communities and they're spending in their communities, and that's a good thing.
There are some great points there you've both made. Thank you very much. And reflecting on the opportunities to restore and regenerate areas of both Scotland and Wales, which have suffered for generations in terms of depopulation, is a really important message, and something that I'm sure we'll hear more of. However, I'm going to look now a little bit at more Scottish politics, and so Emma, I'll come to you first, but because in addition to all the other news last week, we also heard Kate Forbes, the Finance Secretary, talking about the resource spending review in Scotland. Now, the spending review, which is the first multi-year plan since 2011, is designed, it is said, to head off a projected £3.5 billion shortfall by 2027. And while some areas of spending have been prioritised for increases, many others will face either a frozen budget over the next 4 years or real terms cash reductions. The plan looks particularly tough on local government and policing, with the overall size of the public sector in Scotland expected to be cut significantly. And Kate Forbes said that there have been years of growth in the public sector due to Brexit and the pandemic, but there must now be a reset. And so she also plans to sell off public buildings and reduce the number of quangos in Scotland. And central funding for councils will be frozen for the rest of the Parliament. And that's raising fears about sharp council tax rises, perhaps. And also a freeze for justice funding means, in real terms, a cut for community justice, legal aid, the police, prison service, fire, prosecution and court services. So, Emma, firstly with you, in broader terms, Kate Forbes talking about a reset in terms of the public sector in Scotland. Now, right-wing politicians tell us that the public sector in Scotland has always been too large, there are too many public employees and so on and so forth. So for Kate Forbes to be saying that the public sector needs to be cut, is that how significant a sea change in terms of Scottish politics do you think that is?
I think one thing that Kate Forbes, in her statement last week, said that obviously this the statement about refresh of how we're going to spend money. So this spending review, it is really important that the budget was made before the cost of living crisis and before universal credit, the £20 uplift was withdrawn. And so we need to think about the best way to spend the money over the rest of the parliamentary session. And one thing that the Cabinet Secretary has focused on is tackling poverty and child poverty especially. So there's real issues about supporting health in the future, supporting health prevention, and part of that is tackling poverty. It's the single most damaging thing that happens in Scotland that leads to poor health, for instance. So I think that the Cabinet Secretary's statement about freezing local authority budgets isn't about slash and burn, as some folk have criticised. We think that that what needs to happen is wise spending, and a multi-year approach is probably welcome. And in order to think about the best way forward, people will be engaged with, be consulted on. She's made a point about many of the buildings that were full of public servants working, are now people working from home. So how do we better utilize the space? What can be done? And then what can be done different with that space, for instance? So it's all very, I'm sure, complicated, very complex, how to figure out what's the best process as we move forward. So I welcome the announcement, and I welcome that this isn't about um, slash and burn of policies. It's about using the money that we have, using it wisely.
Thanks, Emma. That's a great perspective you help us with there. Thank you. And Hugh, turning to you, as Emma was saying, the Scottish government spends hundreds of millions of pounds a year mitigating poverty, which the Scottish government would say arises as a direct result of Tory Westminster policies. Uh, in From a Welsh perspective, do you see similar messages from the Welsh government in terms of, as you say, the extent of devolution is less in Wales, but do you see the same messaging in terms of offering an alternative to austerity and to punishing attempting to starve poor people out of poverty? Are those issues as given as much priority, and are they as live in Wales as they are in Scotland at the moment?
Oh, they're huge. 1 in 3 children in Wales live in poverty, and in some places, it's 1 in 2. Again, another thing that's come from the partnership deal is extending free school meals to all children across Wales in primary schools, and hopefully. I think Plaid Cymru have said they're going to extend it to secondary schools, in the local authorities that they control, and they control, I think it's 3 or 4 now. So it is a massive priority. But again, this is one of the reasons why we set up the National Wales and set up Corgi Cymru, is just to make people aware of how devolution works, because I think a lot of people just don't understand that Wales is given X amount of pounds from the UK government, and they can spend that on some whatever part on education, on health, and on transport. The majority was spent on health and education. But basically, what you have, it is for me one of the biggest reasons for independence, because at the moment, all the government in the Senedd in Wales does is administer on behalf of the government in Westminster, be that Conservative or Labour. Unfortunately, it does tend to be majority of the time Conservative, which is, again, as I said before, is a party nobody's ever voted for. So, we need to have more fiscal controls and levers closer to home than we currently do, because at the moment, we're very, very limited in what we can do from an intervention point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Hugh.
Do you know,
Go on, Emma.
it's great to hear about the progressive policies that are being taken forward in Wales, and I think, like, Hugh makes a great great comment about the Plaid Cymru and the cooperation between Plaid Cymru and Wales, and Labour in Wales. And so we're seeing in Scotland, like, these kind of progressive policies, like free school meals and £20 per week for children, and all of this stuff. I mean, my colleague Christine Graham made a great statement in Chamber, saying she was absolutely sick of the Scottish government mitigating against Westminster's austerity from the last 10 years. £770 million is what the Scottish government are putting in every year for mitigating the austerity that's imposed on us by Westminster policy. So I think this collaborative work, Mike Russell, who was our former Cabinet Secretary for Europe, worked well with Mark Drakeford and always enjoyed this whole the process of, let's look at what policies work in the other countries and let's see if we can copy them and share what works well, because I think cooperation is something that works really well.
And I think one thing that's really interesting in Wales, and I don't know whether it's like in Scotland, is you find that the Assembly, the Senedd members, Labour ones, are more progressive, who do put Wales first, whereas Labour MPs, you got people like, Chris Bryant and Stephen Kinnock, who are on Radio 4 every 5 minutes talking about themselves in some shape or form. But, they're very much entwined in that Britishness and, the Parliament of being the mother of Parliament. It's almost as if they're engrossed in it. It's a bizarre situation. I think there's this huge split between Labour MPs in Wales and their Senedd members, and I think that's what I think you can see that split is going to grow as well in the coming months and years.
That's an interesting point, Hugh. Thank you. Emma, coming to you, I was going to excuse me. I was going to dig a little bit more into the resource spending review from last week, because, of course, as part of that, the Finance Secretary has set aside £20 million for a second independence referendum next year, and that's at the same time as making difficult choices about public sector spending in Scotland. Now, of course, the Labour Party has accused the Scottish Government of wasting money on a divisive referendum, but immediately the Scottish Greens stepped in defending the decision and accusing the opposition parties of deliberately misunderstanding how democracy works. So, first question for you, Emma, in the context of this, do you think, is it that both the Labour Party and the Tories in Scotland fundamentally don't understand how democracy works? They refuse to recognise that the SNP are by far the majority, and a second independence referendum was front and centre in the SNP's manifesto.
You're absolutely right, Andrew. Only the Tories would see democracy as divisive. And, the SNP's manifesto did commit to an independence referendum in the early part of this parliamentary session. And when I looked at the £20 million and what proportion that is for the overall budget, it's 0.035%, right? It's hardly anything. So they're basically just using the whole division, divisive, this argument, they caused the cost of living crisis, the Tories. And the Tories in Scotland do nothing to stand up for the people that they're supposed to represent in Scotland. All they do is basically jump on the back of the Westminster Tories and get dragged along with their austerity policies. So it's part of the SNP manifesto. SNP got elected in government. We now have a cooperation agreement with the Greens, who also want independence for Scotland. So I think it's right that we have the funds in order to take forward the commitment to deliver an independence referendum next year.
Thanks, Emma. And Hugh, insofar as you don't have a dog in this particular fight, and so you've maybe got a perspective on it, to your mind, does £20 million planning for a fundamental manifesto commitment made by the government, does that sound like good value for money to you?
Well, when you think that Rishi Sunak spent £500,000, which is what 5%, a good chunk of £20 million just on doing focus groups and PR work to try and improve his image, it puts it into perspective. But I think it's interesting as well. Again, if you're aware that the Welsh Labour, Plaid Cymru, and the Liberal Democrats have launched a constitutional sort of review of Wales. So that's under the chairmanship of Lord McAllister, who's a former Plaid member, and Rowan, the former Archbishop of Wales. But they've got Kirsty Williams, ex-Lib Dem minister, Albert Owen from Labour, and Leanne Wood, who was former leader of Plaid. So, they are working collaboratively and in a grown-up fashion. And I think that's the positive thing in Wales, is that, whatever the difference is politically when it comes down to it, Labour and Plaid, and the Liberal Democrats and the Greens as well, who've increased their support in Wales in the recent times, having grown-up conversations, as sitting down and speaking to each other and discussing what is best for Wales. And I think that's a lesson that Labour in Scotland could learn from Wales.
Thanks, Hugh. And Emma, do you think the same question briefly to you? Do you think £20 million planning for the next independence referendum in Scotland is good value for money?
Yes, I do. You know, I moved back from California to be in Scotland so that I could help promote independence, because it is the best way for Scotland to be a socially progressive European country and support the citizens in Scotland. So I look forward to hearing about the progress of taking forward the plans for independence. And in fact, next week in Dumfries, there is a march and then a rally that I will be speaking at, because we do need to make sure that people in the south also know there's a fair bit of support for independence in the south of Scotland as well. And we need people to engage, and we need to engage with them so they can hear what the benefits of being a normal, independent country are. And so next Saturday, I'll be very happy to join everybody in the streets of Dumfries in the town centre.
That's brilliant. That's a great plug for the march and the rally next weekend, Emma. Thank you. And thank you, and in particular, thank you, because that was our final item this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of the viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news and current affairs. Please help us to continue to make these programmes. If you would like to support us, then please subscribe or donate to Broadcasting Scotland. You'll find the link to do that on the screen now. You will find our appeals for assistance on Facebook and Twitter, because the urgent need for financial support has not gone away, and our current appeal for your financial help has a deadline of the 15th of June. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can also find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot and by searching for Broadcasting Scotland on Facebook. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us then. I hope you've enjoyed a tasty full Scottish this afternoon. Thank you to everyone who has been watching, and a huge thanks to Emma Harper, MSP, and to Hugh Marshall for their contributions today. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
I hope that you have a very peaceful Sunday and can join us again here on Broadcasting Scotland very soon. Bye-bye.